Greetings everyone, my name is Gigi and this is Let's Build. Wherein I build a Lego set, time to different media and talk about the facts concerning the topic of the build. Today's build is the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs Cottage versus Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs for the Game Boy Color. All footage I am using is for science, educational, and research purposes. My content is transformative and protected under fair use. All footage is time-lapse with commentary. I apologize in advance for pronouncing any names or places incorrectly. Specifications for the Lego set. Share your passion for a classic Disney movie with this detailed Lego Disney Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs Cottage display model. The collectible building kit for adults features an opening cottage with sleeping, dining, and music areas, plus a kitchen with a light brick. Batteries for the light brick are included in the hearth to add a glow. One side of the roof can also be removed for easier access, and there's a small buildable wishing well and forest scene with a glass casket. The set includes 10 well-known Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs characters: Snow White, the evil queen in disguise, the prince, Doc, Dopey, Bashful, Grumpy, Happy, Sleepy, and Sneezy, plus 6 Lego Disney animal figures. This premium Lego Disney set for adults makes a distinctive display or themed gift for movie lovers. You can also enjoy an intuitive building experience with the Lego Builder app, where you can zoom in and rotate the model in 3D, track progress, and save your sets in one place. Lego sets for adults appeal to any adult fan of Disney movies, including yourself, with a collectible Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs Cottage buildable set full of nostalgic details. Build and display. This building set for adults includes a cottage that opens for display with removable roof section, light brick with included batteries, and multiple rooms, plus 2 smaller builds. Iconic movie characters, featuring Snow White, the evil queen in disguise, the prince, Bashful, Doc, Dopey, Grumpy, Happy, Sleepy, and Sneezy, plus 6 Lego Disney animal figures. Spark some joy. This collectible Lego Disney construction set lets adult fans enjoy a challenging build full of classic details from the movie that helps you create a piece for display. Disney movie gift with 10 Lego Disney minifigures, a buildable cottage, and 2 smaller birds. This construction set makes a display-worthy gift or treat for you or another adult Disney fan. Dimensions. The 2,229-piece display set for adults includes a buildable cottage that measures over 8 inches high, 14 inches wide, and 7.5 inches deep. Once upon a time, a princess named Snow White captivated audiences worldwide in the first ever full-length feature animated Disney movie. Get ready for a Lego building experience that takes you on a magical journey through Snow White's world. Make a wish at the wishing well, make yourself at home in the iconic cozy cottage, and break the evil queen's spell to give Snow White her happily ever after. It was a magical experience to explore the beautiful details of the movie and capture them in Lego form, said by Ryan Baird van Wolkram, Lego designer. An icon in the making. Walt Disney believed so strongly in his vision of a full-length animated movie and worked tirelessly to bring Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs to the big screen. To recreate lifelike moments and facial expressions, animators used models, dancers, and actors as references. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is a 1937 American animated musical fantasy film produced by Walt Disney and released by RKO Radio Pictures, based on the 1812 German fairy tale Snow White by the Brothers Grimm. The film was supervised by David Hand and a team of 5 sequence directors: Perce Pearce, William Cottrell, Larry Morey, Wilfred Jackson, and Ben Sharpstein. It is the first animated feature film produced in the United States and the first cel animated feature film. Snow White premiered at Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles, California on December 21st, 1937, and went into general release in the United States on February 4th, 1938. Despite initial doubts from the film industry, it was a critical and commercial success, with international earnings of more than $8 million during its initial release, against a $1.5 million production cost, becoming the highest-grossing film of 1938 and briefly holding the record of the highest-grossing sound film of all time. It was also the highest-grossing animated film for 55 years. The popularity of the film has led to its being re-released theatrically many times, until its home video release in the 1990s. Adjusted for inflation, it is one of the top 10 performers at the North American box office and is still the highest-grossing animated film with an adjusted gross of $2,297 million. Worldwide, its inflation-adjusted earnings top the animation list. Snow White was nominated for Best Musical Score at the Academy Awards in 1938. And the next year, producer Walt Disney was awarded an honorary Oscar for the film. The award was unique, consisting of one normal-sized plus 7 miniature Oscar statuettes. They were presented to Disney by Shirley Temple. Snow White was a landmark release in the early animation industry, and it is widely regarded as one of the greatest and most influential films ever made, credited with ushering in the golden age of animation. Disney's take on the fairy tale has had a significant cultural impact, resulting in popular theme park attractions, a video game, Broadway musical, and a 2025 live-action film remake. In 1989, the United States Library of Congress deemed the film culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, and selected it as one of the first 25 films for preservation in the National Film Registry. The American Film Institute ranked it among the 100 greatest American films, and also named the film as the greatest American animated film of all time in 2008. Plot: having lost both her parents at a young age, Snow White is a princess living with her wicked and cold-hearted stepmother, the Queen. Fearing that Snow White's beauty will outshine her own, the Queen forces her to work as a scullery maid and asks her magic mirror daily, who is the fairest one of all. For years, the mirror always answers that the Queen is pleasing her. One day, Snow White meets and falls in love with a prince who overhears her singing. That same day, the magic mirror deems Snow White as the fairest. The Queen orders her huntsman to take Snow White into the forest, kill her, and bring back her heart in a jeweled box as proof. The huntsman cannot bring himself to kill Snow White, and warns her of the Queen's intentions. At his urging, Snow White flees deep into the forest. Lost and frightened, Snow White is befriended by woodland animals, who lead her to a hidden woodland cottage. Finding 7 small chairs in the cottage's dining room, Snow White assumes the cottage is untidy home of 7 orphaned children. With the animals' help, she proceeds to clean the place and cook a meal. Snow White soon learns that the cottage is the home of 7 dwarfs, named Doc, Grumpy, Happy, Sleepy, Bashful, Sneezy, and Dopey, who work in the nearby mine. Returning home, they are alarmed to find their cottage clean and suspect that an intruder has invaded their home. Snow White introduces herself and explains her predicament, and the dwarfs agree to let her stay for her protection. Snow White does the cooking and the washing for the dwarves while they mine for jewels during the day, and at night they all sing, play music, and dance. Back at the castle, the magic mirror reveals that Snow White is still living, and with the dwarves. Enraged that the huntsman gave her a pig's heart, the queen uses a potion to disguise herself as an old peddler, and then creates a poisoned apple that will put whoever eats it into sleeping death. She learns the curse can be broken by love's first kiss, but is certain Snow White will be buried alive before this can happen. The queen goes to the cottage while the dwarfs are away at work. The animals see through the disguise but are unable to warn Snow White. They rush off to find the dwarfs. The queen fools Snow White into biting into the apple, and she falls into a death-like slumber. The dwarfs return with the animals as the queen leaves the cottage and give chase, trapping her on a cliff. She tries to roll a boulder onto them, but lightning strikes the cliff before she can do so, causing her to fall to her death. In the cottage, the dwarfs find Snow White asleep from the poison. Unwilling to bury her, they instead place her in a glass coffin in the forest. Together with the animals, they keep watch over her. The following spring, the prince learns of Snow White's eternal sleep and visits the coffin. Saddened by her apparent death, he kisses her, breaking the spell and awakening her. The dwarfs and animals rejoice as the prince takes Snow White to his castle. Production. Development. Walt Disney conceived the idea of making his first feature-length film in 1933, when his animation studio was focusing on production of animated short films, such as the Silly Symphonies series. Although they were popular with the audience, Disney believed that the shorts did not bring enough profit for the further growth of the studio. He also saw the full-length film as a way to expand his storytelling possibilities, allowing for elaborate plots and character development. By late March 1933, he was approached by Mary Pickford, co-founder of United Artists, that was distributing Disney's works at the time, with a proposal for a feature-length, animated live-action version of Lewis Carroll's novel Alice's Adventures in Wonderland from 1865. However, the project was soon scrapped when Paramount Pictures began production of their own film version. Disney then considered using the same concept for a film adaptation of Washington Irving's short story Rip Van Winkle from 1819, starring Will Rogers. But it did not work out either due to Paramount, which held the rights to the story, refusing to give permission. After the successful release of the Silly Symphony short Three Little Pigs in May of 1933, Disney was strengthened in his decision to make a feature film and began introducing the idea to his staff through a slow infiltration, sharing it with everyone individually during casual conversations. He entered into negotiations with Marion C. Cooper to produce a full-length animated version of Victor Herbert's 1903 operetta Babes in Toyland in Technicolor. The project was offered to RKO Radio Pictures, which owned the rights to the play, but RKO executives rejected it. In July 1933, Disney first revealed his plans on making a feature film to the Film Daily, although he had not quite managed to receive a response from the United Artists executives. And around the same time, he was approached with an offer for an animated version of Felix Salten's 1923 novel Bambi: A Life in the Woods, in alliance with Sidney Franklin. Disney eventually rejected the idea, feeling that his studio was not ready for the technical challenges that Bambi would have presented. Homer's poems, Iliad and Odyssey, as well as Jonathan Swift's 1726 books Gulliver's Travels, were also suggested to Disney at the time. Disney settled on the Brothers Grimm's 1812 fairy tale Snow White in the spring of 1934. He had been familiar with the story since he was a teenager, having seen the 1916 silent film version, which he later cited as the primary reason for choosing Snow White for his first feature production. Disney had originally planned to produce Snow White as a silly symphony short, but reconsidered, believing that the story had enough potential for a feature film adaptation. He formally announced his plans on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs to the New York Times in June 1934, estimating that the film could be produced for a budget of $250,000, which was roughly 10 times the budget of the average silly symphony. The project, then known as the Feature Symphony, was initially developed by a small unit of writers that Disney personally supervised, before it was introduced to the studio staff at large on October 30th, 1934, when the basic story outline was completed. As some animators later recalled, Disney assembled them on a soundstage in the evening and acted out an entire story of Snow White for 3 hours, concluding with announcement for their first feature film. Although the studio staff were excited about the project, they were unsure that the full-length cartoon would sustain an audience's attention. Ward Kimball said that they were told by Hollywood moguls such as W.C. Fields that it was okay, 6-7 minutes, like the shorts, but at an hour and a half, no way. Big reason was that you could run out of funny things to do, and you had to have a laugh a minute, and the bright colors would hurt your eyes, everyone would get up and walk out. Walt, of course, plugged ahead, as he didn't believe that. He felt that if you had a solid story, not only laughs in it, but tragedy, it would go. Both Disney's wife Lillian and his brother Roy, who was also his business partner, attempted unsuccessfully to talk him out of it, and the movie industry insiders derisively referred to the film as Disney's folly while it was in production. Early writing. The earliest known story outline, titled Manuscript, was compiled by staff writer Richard Creedon on August 9, 1934, featuring 21 pages of suggestions for characters, scenes, and songs, including Someday My Prince Will Come. At the time, Disney adopted a wide-ranging approach, remaining open to any idea that could be proposed. Notably, one of the suggestions included Snow White traveling through a series of enchanted sites, such as a Sleepy Valley, the Morass of Monsters, and the Valley of Dragons, before arriving at the Dwarfs' Cottage. Snow White was originally envisioned to be more tomboyish, with the queen described as a stately, beautiful in the way of a Benda mask, a cool, serene character who demonstrates her fury only in moments of great passion. One of the potential storylines developed for the manuscript involved the queen imprisoning the prince in her dungeon after seeing his affection for Snow White, with the prince later fighting his way out of her castle with tricks that Doug Fairbanks would like to have thought. Other story suggestions included the queen having a collection of her former enemies reduced to a few inches in size, a Gilbert and Sullivan-style musical number for the scene where the queen orders the huntsman to kill Snow White, and the sequence of the queen trying to break the mirror upon learning that Snow White had survived, with the mirror detaching itself from the wall and smashing against the queen after chasing her around the chamber. Disney also decided from the beginning that each of the seven dwarfs, whom he considered the strongest lure of the story because of their comedic potential, should have distinct personality, identified by a respective name. A pool of over 50 possibilities was compiled for the manuscript. Names such as Sleepy, Hoppy, Bashful, Happy, Sneezy, Wheezy, Big O Ego, and Awful at the top of the contenders. In October 1934, Disney began holding weekly story meetings with a small unit of writers, which included Creedon, Larry Morey, Ted Sears, Albert Herder, and Pinto Colvig. During the first meeting on October 3rd, several scenes were proposed. The soup eating, where Snow White has dinner with the dwarfs, and bed building, where the dwarves build a bed for Snow White. Sequences, Snow White teaching the dwarves to pray, and the climactic scene of the dwarves chasing the disguised queen, followed by her death from falling off a cliff. For the next meeting, held October 9th, a typed sheet was compiled featuring a redefined selection of names for the dwarves: Wheezy, Jumpy, Baldy, Grumpy, Happy, Doc, and Sleepy, and their respective characteristics. Several alternatives were also suggested, including Hickey, Sniffy, Stuffy, Shorty, Burpy, Tubby, Dizzy, and Dopey. From the outset, Disney wanted to discard the part from the Grimm's original story where the queen tries to kill Snow White with a tightly laced bodice, but considered retaining the other two attempts, with a poisoned comb and the poisoned apple, both of which were discussed at this meeting. The storyline of the prince's imprisonment by the queen, first introduced in the manuscript, was also elaborated. After failing to kill Snow White with the comb, the queen would throw the prince into a dungeon and use magic to make the skeletons of her previous victims dance for him, identifying one skeleton as Prince Oswald. When the disguised queen would have left for the dwarves' cottage with the poisoned apple, Snow White's bird friends were to help the prince escape from the dungeon, fight the queen's guards, and find his horse. The prince would then go after the queen, taking the wrong road in the process. Other discussions included the dwarfs' discovery of Snow White in their cottage, two disguises for the queen, a fat, bulgy peddler, and a thin, hawk-faced witch, for each of her attempts to kill Snow White, and the scene of Snow White kissing the dwarfs goodbye before they leave for work. At the meeting, Disney also insisted that the writers refer to the dwarves as Seven Little Men, which was maintained for the rest of the production. Other examples of the more comical nature of the story at this point included suggestions for a fat, batty, cartoon-type, self-satisfied queen. The prince was also more of a clown and was to serenade Snow White in a more comical fashion. Walt Disney encouraged all staff at the studio to contribute to the story, offering $5 for every gag. Such gags included the dwarfs' noses popping over the foot of the bed when they first meet Snow White. Disney became concerned that such a comical approach would lessen the plausibility of the characters and, sensing that more time was needed for the development of the queen, advised an outline circulated on November 6th that attention be paid excessively to scenes in which only Snow White, the dwarves, and their bird or animal friends appear. The names and personalities of the dwarves, however, were still open to change. A meeting on November 16th resulted in another outline entitled Dwarfs Discover Snow White, which introduced the character of Dopey, who would ultimately prove to be the most successful of the dwarf characterizations. In the original storyboard, Dopey was very talkative, but no suitable voice actors could be found. Mel Blanc was given a try without success. It was suggested to make him mute instead. For the rest of 1934, Disney further developed the story by himself, finding a dilemma in the characterization of the queen, who he felt could no longer be fat and batty, but a stately, beautiful type, a possibility already brought up in the previous story meetings. reworking. Disney did not focus on the project again until the autumn of 1935. It was believed that the Silly Symphony short, The Goddess of Spring, from 1934, may have placed doubt in his studio's abilities to animate a realistic girl. Apparently, a 3-month trip to Europe that summer restored his confidence. At this point, Disney and his writers focused on the scenes in which Snow White and the dwarves are introduced to the audience, and to each other. He laid out the likely assignments for everyone working on the film in a memorandum on November 25, 1935, and decided on the personalities of the individual dwarfs. It had first been thought that the dwarfs would be the main focus of the story, and many sequences were written for the 7 characters. However, at a certain point, it was decided that the main thrust of the story would be provided by the relationship between the Queen and Snow White. For this reason, several sequences featuring the dwarves were cut from the film. The first, which was animated in its entirety before being cut, showed Doc and Grumpy arguing about whether Snow White should stay with them. Another, also completely animated, showed the dwarves eating soup noisily and messily. Snow White unsuccessfully attempts to teach them how to eat like a gentleman. A partially animated sequence involved the dwarves holding a lodge meeting, in which they try to think of a gift for Snow White. This was to be followed by an elaborate bed-building sequence, in which the dwarves and the forest animals construct and carve a bed for the princess. This was also cut, as it was thought to slow down the movement of the story. The soup-eating and bed-building sequences were animated by Ward Kimball, who was sufficiently discouraged by their removal to consider leaving the studio. Disney, however, persuaded him to stay by promoting Kimball to be the supervising animator for Jiminy Cricket in Disney's next feature, Pinocchio, 1940. Casting. Adriana Caselotti was the first audition for the role of Snow White in September 1934. She was invited to audition after Disney's casting director, Roy Scott, telephoned her father, who was a vocal coach in Los Angeles, in search for a voice talents, and Caselotti, overhearing their conversation, recommended herself for the part. Although Walt Disney was impressed with her voice, he auditioned about 150 other actresses and singers. These included Deanna Durbin, whom Disney rejected because he thought she sounded too mature. Virginia Davis was nearly hired to provide the speaking voice of Snow White, as well as the live-action reference for the character, but eventually dropped out due to finding the contract unacceptable, although some of Davis's miscellaneous vocal tracks were used in the final film. Caselotti was cast as Snow White in September of 1935, exactly 1 year after her first audition, and recorded her first tracks on January 20th, 1936. She was called in for 44 days of recording sessions within 2 years, receiving $20 for each day. In total, Caselotti was paid $970. Thelma Hubbard provided Snow White's screams in the forest flight scene, and later voiced the character in the film's 1938 Spanish dub and Lux Radio Theater adaptation. The studio auditioned over a dozen actresses for the role of the Queen before Lucille Laverne was chosen, although several members of Disney's staff contended that she sounded a little too old for the part. Having portrayed similar characters in Orphans of the Storm from 1921 and A Tale of Two Cities from 1935, Laverne also tried out for the role of the witch, and the animators initially felt that her voice was too smooth and not rough enough, until she removed her false teeth. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs marks Laverne's final film performance before her death in 1942. Kenny Baker was temporarily considered for the role of the prince, with several other actors tested before Harry Stockwell was cast in 1936. Reginald Barlow and Cy Kendall recorded the preliminary dialogue for the Huntsman, but both were deemed unsatisfactory for the final cut. The role was eventually given to Stuart Buchanan, who was hired by the studio as casting director and dialogue coach in 1936. Story meeting notes from October 9th, 1934 indicate that Hetty Holden and Billy Bletcher were initially considered for the role of Doc until Atwell was cast in early 1936. Radio actor John Gibson initially auditioned for the part of Sleepy and recorded some dialogue at a pre-recorded session in February of 1936. After reading about the casting in a Variety article, Gilbert, who was known for his signature sneeze, telephoned Disney to try out for the role. Disney agreed to audition him and, upon witnessing Gilbert's sneezing routine, hired him on the spot. Animation. Art direction. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs features contributions from 3 European artists who came to work at Walt Disney Studios in the 1930s. By 1936, Albert Herter was assigned to supervise the film's art direction. All the designs used for the film, from the character costume designs to layouts and backgrounds, had to meet his approval before being finalized. Having had academic art training, Herter was instrumental in devising the film's overall Germanic look, incorporating European illustrations and painting techniques into the animation. Ferdinand Horvath, who had been working at the studio since '34, was also hired as the film's inspirational sketch artist, providing a number of dark concepts for the film. Many of his other designs were ultimately rejected since they were less easily translated to animation than Herter's, and Hovarth did not receive a credit for the film. By the spring of '36, the animation process had begun, with Herver and Hovarth being joined by Gustav Tenggren. Tenggren, a color stylist, determined the staging and atmosphere of many of the scenes of the film, with his style borrowing from the likes of Arthur Rackham and John Bauer, and thus possessing the European illustration quality that Disney sought. He also designed the posters for the film and illustrated the press book. Other artists to work on the film included Joe Grant, whose most significant contribution was the design for the Queen's witch form. Character animation. Art Babbitt, an animator who joined the Disney studio in '32, invited 7 of his colleagues, who worked in the same room as him, to come with him to an art class that he himself had set up at his home in the Hollywood Hills. Though there was no teacher, Babbitt had recruited a model to pose for him and his fellow animators as they drew. These classes were held weekly, and each week more animators would come. After 3 weeks, Walt Disney called Babbitt to his office and offered to provide the supplies, working space, and models required if the sessions were moved to the studio. Babbitt ran the sessions for a month until animator Hardy Gramenke suggested that they recruit Don Graham, an art teacher from the Chouinard Institute. Graham taught his first class at the studio on November 15, 1932, and was joined by Philip L. Dyke a few weeks later. These classes were principally concerned with human anatomy and movement, though instruction later included action analysis, animal anatomy, and acting. Though the classes were originally described as a brutal battle, with neither instructor nor students well versed in the other's craft, the enthusiasm and energy of both parties made the classes stimulating and beneficial for all involved. Graham often screened Disney shorts and, along with the animators, provided critique featuring both strengths and weaknesses. For example, Graham criticized Babbitt's animation of Abner the Mouse in The Country Cousin, as taking a few of the obvious actions of a drunk without coordinating the rest of the body, while praising it for maintaining its humor without getting dirty or mean or vulgar. The country mouse is always having a good time. Very few animators at Disney Studio had the artistic training. Most had been newspaper cartoonists. Among the few who did were Grim Natwick, who had trained in Europe. The animator's success in designing and animating Betty Boop for Fleischer Studios showed an understanding of human female anatomy, and when Walt Disney hired Natwick, he was given female characters to animate almost exclusively. Attempts to animate Persephone, the female lead for The Goddess of Spring, had proved largely unsuccessful. Natwick's animation of the heroine in Cookie Carnival showed greater promise, and the animator was eventually given the task of animating Snow White herself. Though live-action footage of Snow White, with the prince and the queen being shot as reference for the animators, the artist's animators disapproved of rotoscoping, considering it to hinder the production of effective caricature. Nevertheless, all of the above-mentioned characters were fully rotoscoped and utilized by their respective artists, some more, some less. Despite Graham and Natwick's objections, however, some scenes of Snow White and the Prince were directly traced from the live-action footage. It proved difficult to add color to Snow White and the Queen's faces. Eventually, they found a red dye that worked, and which was added with a small piece of cotton wrapped around a tipple pencil on each individual cell. Helen Auger, an employee at the ink department, was also an animator and decided to use the same system used in animation. The method was so time-consuming that it was never used again on the same scale. It was also used to a smaller degree in Pinocchio and Fantasia, but after Auger left the studio in 1941, there was no one else with the same expertise who could replace her. Music and records. The songs in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs were composed by Frank Churchill and Larry Morey. Paul J. Smith and Lee Harline composed the incidental music score. Songs from the film include Hi Ho, Someday My Prince Will Come, and Whistle While You Work. Since Disney did not have its own music publishing company at the time, the publishing rights for the music and songs were administered through Born Co. Music Producers, which continues to hold these rights. In later years, the studio was able to acquire back the music rights for many of their other films, but not Snow White, Pinocchio, or Dumbo, or most of the Silly Symphony cartoons. Snow White became the first American film to have a soundtrack album, released in conjunction with the feature film. Cinematic influences. At this time, Disney had also encouraged his staff to see a variety of films. These ranged from the mainstream, such as MGM's Romeo and Juliet from 1936, to which Disney made a direct reference in a story meeting pertaining to the scene in which Snow White lies in her glass coffin, to the more obscure, including European silent cinema. Romeo and Juliet also inspired the balcony scene between Snow White and Prince Charming. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, as well as the two Disney films that follow it, were influenced by such German expressionist films as Nosferatu from 1922 and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920, both of which were recommended by Disney to his staff. This influence is particularly evident in the scenes of which Snow White is fleeing through the forest and the Queen's transformation into the witch. The latter scene was also inspired by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from 1931, which Disney made specific reference in the story meetings. Financial issues. Disney had to mortgage his house to help finance the film's production, which ran up a total cost of $1,400,000 $488,422.74, a massive sum for a feature film in 1937. Midway through, Disney needed a $250,000 loan to finish the film. Disney ran a rough cut for Joseph Rosenberg of Bank of America, who sat impassively during the showing. Then Rosenberg turned to the worried Disney and said, "Wait, that thing is going to make a hatful of money," and approved the loan. Release: Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered at the Carthay Circle Theater on December 21st, 1937. The film received a standing ovation at its completion from an audience that included Judy Garland, Marlene Dietrich, and Charles Laughton. 6 days later, Walt Disney and the Seven Dwarfs appeared on the cover of Time magazine. 3 weeks later, it opened at the Radio City Music Hall in New York City and a theater in Miami, January 1938, in which the strong box office sales encouraged RKO Radio Pictures to place the film into general release February 4th. It became a major box office success, becoming the most successful sound film of all time, in which it displaced Al Jolson's The Singing Fool from 1928. Snow White would soon be displaced from this position by Gone with the Wind in December of '39. Snow White proved equally popular with foreign audiences. It premiered in London on February 24th, 1938, ironically the same night as Charles Laughton's first film as a producer, Vessel of Wrath, leading to a poor turnout for the latter. In September of '38, Variety reported that the film was having a remarkably long box office run at theaters in Sydney, Australia. In that city, it noted, Walt Disney's Snow White experienced no difficulty at hitting 11 weeks, with more ahead. Variety reported as well that Snow White was having even longer runs in other cities overseas, such as in London, where the film had generated greater box office receipts than its exclusive New York screenings at Radio City Music Hall. According to RKO, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had earned $7,846,000 in international box office receipts by the end of its original theatrical run. This earned RKO a profit of $380,000. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is also a video game based on the film of the same name, released for the Game Boy Color in November 15th of 2001, shortly following the release of the film's Platinum Edition DVD. Developed by Planet Interactive and published by Ubisoft Entertainment. Journey into Walt Disney's enchanting adventure as the fairest princess of them all. Help Snow White avoid the evil clutches of the jealous queen and seek refuge in the dwarf's forest home. Beware of strangers peddling apples and find Prince Charming, your true love, to live happily ever after. An animated storybook for your Game Boy Color. Beat each challenge to follow the classic story of Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Find all of your favorite characters: Snow White, Dopey, Happy, Grumpy, Sleepy, Sneezy, Bashful, Doc, Prince Charming, and the Wicked Queen. 2 modes of fun. In Story Mode, explore 7 levels and win bonus games to unlock chapters in the delightful tale. Discover exciting mini-games and challenging puzzles in Playground Mode. In this game, you get to play as both Snow White and later as Grumpy. Bonus game today, since Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs for the Game Boy Color is a pretty short game, we have Disney Princess. Disney Princess is a 2003 action-adventure video game developed by Artco Ltd. for the Game Boy Advance. The game has the princesses completing several levels. Gameplay. Designed to appeal to young girls, Disney Princess offers 6 different stories that center on Snow White, Belle, Aurora, Cinderella, Ariel, and Jasmine, who play through different levels and defeat their respective movies' villains. Snow White doesn't fight directly, but can summon the 7 dwarfs with magic music to fight against the evil queen. Snow White, Chapter 1. The Dark Woods. Oh dear. 3 of the 7 dwarves have been turned into stone statues by the evil queen. They will stay this way unless jewels with magical powers are found. Search the dark woods for the jewels that help out Snow White's friends. When you walk along the path in the dark woods, you'll come along spiders and menacing trees that will scare Snow White. These spiders will move up and down along their webs, so wait for them to retreat before you move past them. To deal with the menacing trees, press the B button to sing. Snow White's voice will lull the trees to sleep and allow her to pass. If you see sparkling lights in the forest, press up on the control pad. The lights will lead you to new paths. As you move around the dark woods, you will find several treasure chests along the path. Approach these treasure chests and press the A button to open them. Some treasure chests contain gold coins, and some contain jewels you'll need to free the dwarves from these stone statues. Chapter 2. The Dwarves' Mine. Now that Snow White has freed 3 of the 7 dwarves, you are ready to move on to Chapter 2. The evil queen has transformed 3 more dwarves into statues. It is up to Snow White to free them. Cave-ins. The dwarves' mine is filled with many paths. Several of these paths are blocked by boulders. Pressing the B button will sing to summon a dwarf to come and clear the path. Be sure to have some axes for the dwarves to use. If you run out, others are hidden in the mine. Chapter 3. The Evil Queen. 6 of the 7 dwarves have been freed from the clutches of the evil queen. Only 1 dwarf remains imprisoned in the stone statue. It is up to Snow White and the dwarves to defeat her. The queen will throw poisonous apples up into the air that you need to dodge. From time to time, she will need to search her bag for additional poison apples. When you hear the evil queen laugh, this is your opportunity to attack. Press the B button and one of the dwarves will run forward to throw a gem at the queen. Hit her 3 times to defeat her. The Snow White game for the Game Boy Color has very little information available, and I couldn't even find a PDF of the instruction manual, even though I did see it available for sale. The game would be alright as a first game for someone. Very simple. It's basically a collect-a-thon. You have very limited control in easy mode. The game will automatically jump your character, and you have a lot less things that you have to pick up and find. The difficult or challenge mode that I used had many more items to find, but it also gave you the freedom to jump and to maneuver in different ways. Snow White has always had lackluster games where you actually get to play as Snow White. The original film, however, still holds up as a classic and as an excellent piece of filmmaking history. Total build time, 5 hours, 15 minutes, 35 seconds, which means you could watch Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs at 83 minutes, Snow White and the Huntsman at 127 minutes, and Snow White: A Tale of Terror at 100 minutes. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. Remember to like, subscribe, share, ring that bell, all the things for the YouTubes. Thank you.